You strong.
It is a warm spring day. Andreas replies to Chris in a calm voice that he will look forward to this. A week goes by. There are several people at the entrance to the administration office of Rodlin Academy. Vivian walks down the corridor, ignoring the gawkers who stare at her with undisguised interest. The only thing that worries her is that Andreas is late. Pride we're talking. Curious students turn around to see that it is Vivian Belroken herself walking down the corridor. They smile enthusiastically. Vivian grabs her sword and pulls it from her belt. The students walking beside her look at her sword in horror and back away. His face changes. Vivian doesn't care. She simply doesn't pay attention to them. She looks at the reflection in her sword and decides to try to smile, like Lucia did when she met Andreas, and is amazed that he was able to realize. She scrutinizes her reflection and her eyes begin to glow red. She tries to smile to see what it would look like. She looks frustrated at herself in the reflection, and is sad that she is not as cute as Lucia. Suddenly, Andreas walks up to her and calls out to her. Vivian starts to fidget and puts her sword back on her belt faster. Andreas looks at her incomprehensibly and asks what she is doing. He explains to her that it's about to start. Look, and off. Vivian smiles embarrassedly and touches her cheek. She says that nothing happened and that she was just waiting for him. Andreas continues to look at her in surprise and says they should go, pointing with his hand in the direction. Andreas steps forward and then Vivian abruptly grabs him by his robe and calls his name. Calm both of them. Andreas turns to her and still looks at Vivian perplexed. He is startled by her strange behavior. He looks at Vivian, who smiles broadly at him. Her eyes are slightly squinted. She greets Andreas good-naturedly and wishes him a good day. The words make him even more surprised, but he is more amazed that Vivian finally smiles. After a second, Andreas himself changes his face, and in response, Vivian smiles too. He decides to wish her a good day. Carpets are spread in the large hall. On the ceiling hang crystal chandeliers covered with gold. Many people have gathered. Louise stands silently in the hall and listens intently to the story that Selena and Chris are having. Selena spiritedly tells him about Andreas defeating Chris. She adds that she's sorry he wasn't there. Chris indignantly tells her to stop talking about it. Senior Todlin is here too. He walks down the hall and sees Andreas. He looks away angrily. Andreas dislikes him. Andreas and Vivian walk through the hall. Andreas notes that everyone here has achieved some kind of success besides them, and that only people with high grades are here among the first years. He looks around and makes sure that Lucia is not here. Suddenly, a woman's voice behind him calls out to Andreas. He casts a suspicious glance. You get the chance to fight. Standing in front of him is a happy Dina. She smiles widely and is happy that Vivian has come along with him. He remembers Louis. Vivian waves her hand indifferently at Dina. Andreas explains to her that he and she met on the street. He sees that the students from Milko Academy have not arrived yet. Dina argues that since the two academies have agreed, they will definitely come. And tells her it won't be her turn. Suddenly, a crowd of students in red robes walks through the front door. A fat boy walks at the head and chuckles. He gloatingly remarks that there are a lot of cuties in Rodlin. Teacher stands at his desk. The fat man's name is Grez Malone. He is from Milko Academy and is the principal's delegate. He smiles nastily at Dina and says they haven't seen each other in a while and asks her about when she will come to him and become his wife. Lena looks on fearfully from the sidelines. Dina notes that he is always arrogant. She looks at Grez in disgust and tells him to stop acting like that and not to talk to her, calling him nasty. Andreas knows, hurt by Dina's words. Grez angrily tells her that with this attitude she will not get any man. Dina gets disgusted by these words and she makes a grimace. An unfazed Vivian asks Dina if she and Grez are going to get married. An exasperated Dina emphatically tells her no. She explains that he's just Principal Milko's son, which is why she met him a couple times when they were kids. Vivian looks at Grez with arrogance and says he's a strange pig. Andreas looks at her warily. Professional. Grez, hearing Vivian say something to him, rushes over to her and asks her about her calling him cute and did she like him. He, fixing his hair flirtatious, begins to suggest to Vivian that they meet in the evening. Vivian looks at him with rejection. At this point, the announcer begins to welcome the students Rodlin and Milko. An angry Grez turns around to the announcer and tisks annoyed. He says he's ruined everything. Dina, no longer holding back, angrily yells at Grez that he just had his life saved and calls him a pig! Same sec. The students move closer to the stage and listen to the presenter. He announces that in the coming weeks there will be a series of meetings where they will be given a chance to develop their skills in friendly competition with each other. Blue. The host suggests that they start by standing according to their faculty, knights on the left and mages on the right. Vivian listens to him in surprise. Andreas is confused. Tightly in her hand, Vivian, embarrassed, tells Andreas that she wishes she could have been with him longer. Andreas looks at her good-naturedly and laughs sweetly. The next day comes. Meetings begin that Andreas knew nothing about. The professor draws a magic symbol on a sheet of paper. At this point he explains that if they cast a reverse spell on the magic associated with the rotation, the gray-haired professor extends his hand in the air. A multicolored magic ball forms above it. He explains that, based on the words he said, it turns out to be this. His eyebrows furrowed. The students are listening to the professor intently. He tells them to try to draw the magic circle themselves. Andreas grew bored. He is bored with the stories about magic circles. He sits leaning on his palm and listens to the lecture without much interest. Behind him, the fat man Gra sits and yawns tiredly. Suddenly Andreas's attention stops on the guy sitting next to him. His name is Keklin Volga. He is a playable character who is strong in supporting magic and magic circles. Andreas notes to himself that Keklin is good at this subject. Keklin, seeing that he is being stared at, is slightly embarrassed and asks Andreas if something is wrong. Andreas looks at him confused. And advises him to he doesn't think of anything better to do than introduce himself and smile. He tells Keklin in a friendly way that he hopes they will get along. Keklin smilingly introduces himself. They shake hands as a sign of acquaintance. Andreas politely tells him that it is a pleasure to meet him. Andreas turns his attention to Dina, sitting in front of him. He is excited that now he will be able to watch her and Keklin compete, as they are both recognized geniuses who can even inspire each other. Her family. He thinks for a moment that perhaps he himself can give them inspiration. He looks up enigmatically. Andreas starts diligently and concentrating on drawing what the professor told them to draw. He thinks about the fact that he may lack talent, but that doesn't mean he's bad at making magic circles. At that, Andreas remembers himself as Makoto Kaneshiro. He recalls that he has played this game many times and that he has drawn many different circles. He is confident that he is unrivaled in this endeavor. Andreas hits Selena with such force. Andreas has a magic circle drawn out on a piece of paper. A couple of ideas pop into his head. Andreas draws a circle with interest. He wants to show them something they've never seen before. But he realizes he won't surprise them much if he just changes the side of the circle. He decides that he should try something related to life. Andreas and cannot believe what has happened, for Andreas's attention is distracted by a glowing light that appears next to him. The students sitting next to him are also mesmerized as they stare at it. They are amazed at how many spells there are. Andreas realizes that a magical light is starting to be emitted by Dina, raising her palms and head up. The professor says that this is to be expected of her, as she is above the level of the students. Selena not believing her, Andreas looks at the magic light with admiration. He realizes that she has inverted the magic circle, and the water is spinning around it. He notes that it is Dina's style to make everything bright. Dina clenched her fist in concentration and squeezed her eyes shut. Andreas thought so because geniuses are scary. Keklin announces that he too has finished drawing. His magic circle didn't fit on his piece of paper. He is upset about this, because if the paper had been bigger, he could have made his magic circle more interesting. Chris asks him why he saw. Keklin places his palm on his drawing of the magic circle. A bright light like lightning begins to emanate from it at that very second. Andreas stares mesmerized at what is happening. His eyes are wide open, his eyebrows are furrowed, and his mouth is slightly open. Eyes wide. Gra watches with envy at what Keklin is doing and opens his mouth wide. The magical light begins to slowly fill the entire auditorium. The students are screaming in fright. They are amazed at what is happening in class. Andreas stares fearfully at Keklin's magic circle. He wonders to himself that perhaps this is someone's joke. The light spreads throughout the classroom. The students watch in horror with their mouths wide open. The gray-haired professor, as well as everyone, is mesmerized, watching what is happening without taking his eyes off. With a focused look, Keklin looks contentedly at what is happening. He explains that it is illusion magic, created by spinning and turning. He says that it has a short duration, so it will quickly return to its normal state. He asks, everything around is engulfed in magical light. The students stare in horror at Keklin as he holds his hands in the air, pointing his palms toward each other in an inspired manner. because Andreas watches all of this admiringly. His eyes are wide, his mouth slightly open. Drops of sweat come to his face. He realizes that Keklin is an even greater genius than he thought. He realizes that he continues to use the bright light continues to hover over the drawing of Keklin's magic circle. The light begins to slowly dissolve. Keklin rubs his head guiltily and laughs. He says that it looks like more research needs to be done to make it last longer. All the students stare at him mesmerized. Anytime, Dina good-naturedly turns to him and enthusiastically says that was incredible. Keklin rubs his head in embarrassment and thanks Dina for saying what he said. He notes that her lap was awesome too. In a serious voice, Andreas looks at Keklin with interest. He realizes that even Dina can't compete with him in magic circles. He notes that this game is made even more interesting by the fact that each character has their own unique talent. Andreas remembers Lucia, who has electric lightning coming from her fist. She is cursed with a disease, but is the very best in battle magic. Keklin stands on the image of the magic circle, holding a smaller circle in his hands. No one can bypass him in support magic and the magic circle. Andreas shifts his gaze to Dina, who stares pensively into the distance. She is unrivaled in time and space magic. It is because of this skill that she is notorious for being a cheater character. Walking beside her, look at her sword in horror and back. The professor looks admiringly at the students and notes that Dina and Keklin showed amazing magic circles. He then offers to show the rest of the students what they have prepared. Andreas sadly realizes that he tried his best, but after them, his lap won't be as impressive. A dim light begins to emanate from his image. In the reflection, Andreas brings his palm to his circle and a lovely plant with beautiful buds begins to sprout from it. Andreas reassures himself that he has nothing to be ashamed of. Faster. Suddenly he hears someone's male voice laughing wryly behind him. He turns to the other students and asks them to see what Andreas has done. Vivian smiles. Andreas hears a nasty laugh and turns back unhappily. Behind him, Gras sits and pokes at his flower with his finger. Gres turns to Andreas and asks him where the rotation and turning is. He also adds that his flower isn't even glowing. Gres scrutinizes Andreas's flower, leaning on his hands. He says it's strange that such an idiot could get into a meeting of exchange students. Fatty Gres continues to taunt Andreas, telling him to show everyone how pathetic Rodlin Academy is. Andreas recalls that when he played Keklin, Gres would always pick a fight. That Vivian finally smiles. Andreas is starting to get angry. Everyone avoids Gres and no one follows him. Andreas angrily realizes that he is really annoying him to leave him as he is. At this time, Keklin stares mesmerized at the flower Andreas has created. He opens his mouth wide and admiringly remarks that it is very cool. Andreas looks at Keklin perplexed and doesn't understand how a genius like him can be so admiring of his work. Keklin says that he has never seen such magic before. Gres, sitting behind them, overhears their conversation with envy. Not to be deterred, Gras turns to Keklin to ask if he is blind. He says that everyone can see that it's the most ordinary flower. Dina can't resist Gres' attacks any longer. He abruptly gets up from his seat and tells him that he's the one who should take a better look. Dina gives Gres a snide look and adds that he wouldn't understand what spell is being used here anyway. Andreas knew it would have to be on Dina and Keklin's level to realize what he'd done. Dina puts her arms at her sides and asks Andreas to let her explain what he just did. Andreas indifferently lets her. The students stare at the flower with interest. Dina explains that at first they may all think that the flower was created using the formula nature or life, but that's not all. A beautiful flower creates a bright light around it. Dina goes on to explain that there is a time and rotation formula to complete the cycle of life spell. She says that Andreas added the reverse formula to it and got the flower. The professor listens to Dina's explanation with pleasure. He rolls his eyes and smiles with pleasure. The students are also mesmerized listening to her explanation. They sit with their eyes and mouths wide open. They haven't seen each other. Gras is starting to get angry. Drops of sweat are actively coming to his face. His eyebrows are furrowed, the corners of his mouth down. A strange young man sits a little farther away from him and watches Gras with a satisfied look. Dina gazes admiringly at the flower, which is beginning to bloom. She finishes by adding that, simply put, this flower is both alive and dead at the same time. Andreas has improved the spin and reverse formula, and thus created contradiction. Exasperated Dina, she explains that there's also a formula for life in there as well. Andreas looks at Dina with gratitude and notes that they both explained it very well. Andreas thinks for a moment that it was partly easier for him to create such a spell because he is a necromancer. But it was a bit of a challenge for him not to resort to black magic. Say something to him. Rush. Keklin stares intently at the flower, putting his hand to his chin. He tells Andreas that the more he looks at it, the more he wants to study it. Andreas looks at Keklin and says that he just wanted to add a contradiction there. Dina turns to Malone with a serious look and asks him about how he must have something mesmerizing too. He replies that he certainly has something that doesn't compare to their actions. He gloatingly puts his hands up to his magic circle and chuckles evilly. Andreas and Dina stare at him nonchalantly. A bright magical flash appears in the air with the inscription. The guy sitting next to Malone looks at him fearfully. He sighs heavily and realizes that this is very bad. Malin himself doesn't realize what he's doing. Sparks begin to fly from the flash he created. The guy sitting next to him asks if he's all right. Malin is covered in drops of sweat. He hopes that no one will notice that he just repeated Dina's actions. Dina looks at him in a stupor and asks him what he is doing. She claims he just repeated after her. An enraged Mason screams loudly, clenching his fists. In desperation, he asks her if she has any proof of her words. Andreas stares dejectedly into nothing. He praises Dina for her courage and for realizing at once what had happened here. Dina arrogantly averts her gaze and tells Mason that except for the element formula, everything else is just like her. It turns out the bright purple flash continues to glow. Dina notices that he also applied the wrong levitation formula. She asks him about the fact that he just didn't see it because he was sitting too far away. Malin furiously gets up from his seat and yells at Dina that she's talking utter nonsense. Listens to the lecture. Malin looks completely inadequate. He starts screaming loudly and waving his arms. Sweat runs down his thick cheeks. Dina looks at him with squinted eyes and tells him he's a hopeless. Dina waves the index finger of one hand and creates a magical circle in front of her. Malone is all worked up. A pink light continues to emanate from him. Dina arrogantly declares that he has too many problems. Is wrong. Andreas, unable to think of anything more clever, Malone starts blaming Dina. He tells her, grinning, that she's the one who interfered with his formula, and in a friendly way that he... The professor's nerves are failing. He gets angry and yells at them to shut the two of them up immediately. Malone swings a ball of light at Dina and yells loudly about how dare she make a fool of him. He's so angry he can't control himself. His pupils are constricted. Snot is coming out of his nose. You look furious and pathetic at the same time. All the students, including Dina, look at him surprised and wide-eyed. Malin, furious to the max, continues to hold the hovering fireball in his hand. A little more, and he's sure to throw it at Dina. Andreas turns angrily on Malone. His eyes are hateful and red. He orders him to lower his arm or he will chop him to pieces. Keklin glances warily at Andreas. He wonders fearfully what is happening to him. Malin realizes with horror that he's going to be killed. His eyes look frightened, his eyebrows raised upward. Andreas has a magic... Andreas, without looking in his direction and raising his index finger upwards, tells Malin not to cause trouble at the exchange meeting, and that even after he returns to Milko, that he should not make a big deal out of himself and act normal. Just changes the side of the circle. He decides... Malone sits confused and silent, looking away. He's covered in drops of sweat. These words hurt Malin. He feels humiliated and insulted. Andreas has just put him down in front of everyone. His face is filled with rage. He is about to cry. Milko and Rodlin's students watch with terror in their eyes as they... Malin can no longer control himself and, upset, runs out of the classroom. The professor looks at him confused. The front door slams loudly. The students look in her direction in confusion. The professor only manages to call out his name. Water is spinning. Andreas glances coldly at the door and realizes that Malone will definitely not start behaving appropriately after this. He decides that he will need to speak to him in the language of pain later. The guy sitting next to him gets out of his seat and runs to catch up with Malone. He tells the professor that he will follow him. The professor bewilderedly agrees. Andreas looks suspiciously at the guy who just ran out after Mayon. He looks familiar to him. It's a warm day outside. Malin, who has run outside, bows loudly and annoyed. He lifted his head up and clenched his fists tightly. He is so angry that thick veins swell on his forehead. He angrily screams and blames Andreas and Dina for everything, because they made him look like a complete idiot in front of everyone. He swears he'll kill them. The students are screaming in fright. They are amazed at what is happening in class. Malone is screaming, oblivious to his surroundings. He's angry to the max. At that moment, the guy who ran out of the classroom after him comes up behind him. Malin turns back around confused. His mouth is open. He's flushed, snot and drool flowing from his nose and mouth. The boy rubs his head guiltily and chuckles. He says that Malin probably has him confused with someone else. He looks at him blankly. He says that Malin looks at the guy suspiciously, putting a hand to his chin. He asks him about who he is. The guy calmly introduces himself as Antonio Holt and says he's in his final year at Rodlin and is interning with Professor Kyler in potions. He bows politely to Malin, words because of pride. Even Andreas watches. Antonio looks at Malin understandingly and tells him that he noticed that he was embarrassed that the other students were disrespectful to him. He goes on to talk about how he has something that can help Malin. That he continues. Malin looks at him indignantly and asks what the man said. Antonio angrily turns his head aside. The light begins to slow. Antonio is holding a flask of dark liquid. He explains that the professor has created a potion that temporarily enhances physical strength and mana, but that it has the side effects of temporary loss of taste, and that he is now looking for people to test. And enthusiastically says that was incredible. Antonio holds out the potion to him. He realizes that this is exactly what he needs now. He asks Antonio if that's the only reason the potion hasn't been on sale. Interest. Antonio's gaze turns serious. He frowns his eyebrows. His eyes squint. He asks Malin to try it. He's sure that with this potion he can easily overpower those two. Andreas remembers. Malin instantly remembers the faces of Andreas and Dina. His face changes. He takes pleasure in Antonio's words that he can overpower them. He grins gloatingly. Of the magic circle. At the same second, without thinking, he opens the cork of the flask and swallows its contents. Magic circle. Antonio tries to stop him. He is amazed that Malin decides to drink it all at once. Malin empties the flask and begins to spit. He laughs gloatingly. Antonio gives him a satisfied look. A little while later, he wonders with a sly expression on his face how Malin is feeling. Malin's face took on a fierce look. The veins on his forehead swell even more, his eyebrows frown, and his eyes fill with purple light. He feels that he is full of mana. After them, his lap won't be as impressive. He holds a ripping fireball in his hand and realizes that its power is unbelievable. The insane power overwhelms him. He continues to hold the fireball in his hand and roars loudly. He raises his hand up and lets out a multitude of bright fire rays with unimaginable power. Antonio stands warily behind him. The fireball flies high into the sky. Antonio says that it's all amazing, and that now it won't be hard for him to defeat Andreas and Dina. Gras sits and pokes at his... Malin stands smugly as he continues to point his hand upwards. He marvels at what he is now capable of. He turns to Antonio about asking him to give him all the potions he has. Antonio stands admiringly behind him and watches silently. He realizes that he has done an excellent job. Fatty Gresk. The next day comes. The sunlight brightly illuminates the square of Rodlin Academy. Vivian looks at Dina intently and says that Andreas gave the flower to her. She asks very much that Dina give it to her. Dina is confused. She asks Vivian if she is not a student of the Knights. She asks her what she needs the flower for. Dina stares intently at Vivian and can't understand what she needed him for. She was just about to study the flower herself. Cool. Vivian lowers her head sadly. Dina, unable to refuse her and seeing that she needs him very much, agrees to give him to her. Vivian holds in her hand the sheet with the image of the magic circle that Andreas drew. Dina tells her that she can still draw a new one if she needs to. She tells Vivian that you have to use mana to see the flower. See that it's a little farther away from them. Lucia stands and watches curiously at what Vivian and Dina are doing. Vivian stares mesmerized at the sheet depicting a magic circle from which a beautiful flower begins to grow. She is fascinated by it. Suddenly, someone asks them admiringly about the fact that this is the flower everyone is talking about. Lucia stares at the flower with undisguised curiosity and asks, "Is this the same contradiction that the algae had created?" Meaning Andreas. Dina looks at Lucia and asks her if she can hear anything. She yawns, covering her mouth with her palm, and says that she's out of classes for the day, so she decides she'll go to the lab. Light around it. Lucia focuses her gaze on the light field coming from the flower and says that she feels like something is wrong here. Dina looks at her perplexed. Formula to it and got the flower. She points her finger at the image and says that this part is a little out of place. Dina excitedly replies that she thought so too. Lucius pulls a pen out of her briefcase and cheerfully informs her that she feels that something was purposely hidden in that spot. It's wide open. She starts correcting the drawing and tells Vivian not to move for a few seconds. Vivian looks angrily at what she is doing. She doesn't like it at all that she's making edits to Andreas's work. Dina watches Lucia with interest. Gra with a satisfied. Dina finishes making edits to the image and holds onto the flower. She decides to add a flow spell. She looks focused and inspired. But this flower is. Vivian watches in amazement at all the movements Lucia makes with the flower. Dina, for her part, looks scared. She's afraid that Lucia might mess things up. Exasperated Dina, the girls notice bright glowing lights all around them. They look at the ground, where many beautiful flowers are blooming. They look around perplexed and do not understand. Dina looks at the lights with admiration and says that at first she didn't believe it, but the image really was a double magic circle. Lucia, unable to believe her ears, looks at Dina incredulously and asks her if Andreas did it. He tells Andreas. An unknown long-haired man appears on the grass in front of them. He smirks and says that he has heard rumors about it. The girls look at the unknown man in surprise. Andreas looks and asks. The unknown man is the dean of the magical faculty, Belial Costello. He stands mysteriously and holds the very same Andreas flower in his hand. He notes that to create such a contradiction with basic spells is a mesmerizing innovation. Dina bows low before him and apologizes for them activating the magic circle in such a place. Belial, disregarding her words, asks about who created the circle. Dina guiltily replies that it was created by fourth-year student Andreas Cromwell. She looks pityingly at the dean. Guy sitting next to him, Dean Belial looks thoughtfully at the flower and realizes that they are talking about someone who has been on everyone's lips lately. A strange man with glowing eyes stands with his hands held high in the air. Belial realizes that for a magic circle that was only created for a task, this is on the verge of creating a stumbling block to immortality. The ultimate contradiction. Into nothing. He praises Dina. Belial stands completely absorbed in his musings. The girls look at him questioningly, afraid to say a word. Gaze, and Dina, noticing that Belial has something to ask, decides to ask him about it. But Belial, without a word, turns and walks away. Dina and Lucia stare after him, while Vivian continues to look at the sheet with the image of the magic circle.
Dina is outraged beyond belief. She is annoyed that there is something wrong with him, because first he asked a question and then he just ignored her words and left. Lucia, trying to calm her down, tells her to be quiet because he might hear.
Speaks. Stops on the guy sitting next. Belial stops and squeezes his eyes shut. He thinks it's marvelous. He never thought he could be inspired by a student's work. He decides that he will keep one eye on Andreas Cromwell. In the gymnasium, there are sparring matches on fake swords between students. Luis rubs his forehead contentedly and turns to Vivian to thank her for sparring with him. He notes that she is very strong. Vivian sips indifferently from her water bottle. Vivian, without even looking at Luis, says that he is strong too. He's amused by these words and laughs loudly. Luis looks admiringly at Vivian, eyes wide. He gets frustrated that their conversations are always short. They stand in silence, and at that moment someone's familiar gruff voice comes out. Is that all he can do? He asks. All the students, including Dean, in front of them, a fierce sparring match between Chris and a senior student unfolds. The high school student furiously attacks Chris, swinging his sword, while Chris successfully defends himself. Andreas turns angrily on Malon.
Chris angrily swings his sword and yells at the upperclassmen to shut up.
At this point, the senior gets even angrier and kicks Chris with such force that he flies off a considerable distance. Chris stands up, holding his chest. That's where the blow came from. He tries to catch his breath and frustratedly realizes that it will be hard to beat a senior student now with his faulty fencing. Upwards, tells Malin not to cause. He thinks back to Andreas. He stands, turning slightly around on Chris and advising him to follow his own path and never doubt anything. Andreas's words give him confidence. His gaze becomes more determined, his eyebrows furrowing. He thinks about what Andreas told him to do. He resolutely adopts an attacking stance. At this time, the senior student is already approaching him to make a crushing blow. At this moment, Chris thinks about the fact that the very essence of the Uner style is part of his body. Malin.
The upperclassman is furiously attacking him. His mouth is grinning and wide open. His eyes are insane and very cunning. He tells Chris that whatever he does, the outcome will be the same. A senior student approaches Chris and starts swinging his sword. Chris looks more focused this time and fights him back perfectly.
behaving appropriately. The moment their swords make contact, Chris stares intently and thinks only of his style of unor. The senior looks at him perplexed. He's amazed at how much Chris has changed in this fight. All Chris can think about is that the unor style is a sword that confuses the opponent with ever-changing strikes. Chris asks him why. As the senior swings his sword, Chris is already behind him to make the strike. He recalls Andreas's advice about parrying his opponent's sword and breaking his stance.
The senior is glaring at Chris angrily. He is angry that he is moving so fast and agilely like a worm.
Chris brings his sword up to the senior's face. He decides to deliver the decisive blow. The senior realizes with horror the hopelessness of his situation. Chris nonchalantly holds his sword right in front of the senior's face and calmly announces that he has won. The senior feels ashamed. He throws Chris's sword away with his hand, admitting his defeat. The senior throws his sword to the floor and clucks. He's shocked that he lost to a scumbag like Chris and thinks it's all a bloody clown and that he's had enough. And drool flowing from his nose, Chris confidently shouts after him that this is not clowning around and that his swordsmanship is strong enough. These words hurt the older student even more. He stops. Malin looks at the guy suspiciously, putting a hand to his... Chris is pissed off that the man didn't even turn around to look at him. He tries to call out to him, but all to no avail. Himself as Antonio. The senior frowns and grimaces. He tells Chris to stop flapping his tongue. The senior's patience is completely running out. He throws the sword to Chris. The sword falls to the ground with a clatter. Chris looks at the sword lying in front of him and realizes it's real. Chris is angry and frowning his eyebrows. He doesn't understand what the senior wants from him after all. He just lost in sparring. The upperclassman is angry enough to make the veins swell on his forehead. He opens the stopper of some kind of flask and orders Chris to shut up and get his sword. He wants to make him sorry for making a fool out of him. People to test. Luis and Vivian stand behind him in surprise. Luis advises Chris to just apologize to the senior. Chris, not paying attention to them, focuses his attention on the fact that the senior is taking some kind of potion. Antonio. Suddenly, some unknown man in a robe comes out from around the corner and addresses them. He asks them what they're doing there. This potion he can easily overpower those. The upperclassman drinks the potion from the flask in one gulp. Chris stands confidently, holding a real sword in his hand. The senior's face changes in an instant. It turns red, veins swell all over his face, and his eyes become bloodshot. He begins to make inhuman noises. Chris, watching him from the sidelines, guesses the effect of the potion he drank. Decides to drink. This unknown male is Toddlin. He is confidently walking towards a senior student. The latter asks Toddlin about what a student like him is doing at an exchange meeting. Toddlin, without answering his question, points out to him that it's a real sword. Malin's face took on a fierce. Toddlin, raising one eyebrow, angrily orders him to put the real sword away now. Chris, watching what is going on, is getting very angry. He grits his teeth and bulges his eyes. His hand. Luis opens his mouth in astonishment. Vivian, for her part, watches them indifferently. The senior student calmly swings his real sword at Toddlin. He falls to the floor with a thud. The blood splashes with all his might. And he holds the bloody sword firmly in his hand and addresses Chris, calling him a fucking first year. The senior smirks wryly. His hair is disheveled, his eyebrows furrowed, his eyes bloodshot. He tells Chris that it's time for round. In the middle of the trees stands the Rodlin Academy building. Someone calls out to Andreas, addressing him as Mr. Andreas. Andreas is uncomfortable with this treatment. He looks around questioningly. Kechlin stands in front of him, head bowed. He chuckles guiltily. Andreas asks to be addressed simply by his first name. Kechlin, embarrassed, replies that he is 2 years younger than he is, and asks him to speak to him more simply. Andreas looks suspiciously at Kechlin, not sure what he wants from him. Kechlin, with a smile on his face, asks Andreas about the fact that magic circle was actually a double circle. He asks Andreas about how he was able to come up with it. They walk slowly down the hallway, and Andreas explains to Kechlin that it would be more interesting if they added a hidden element. Andreas tried to hide the fact that he had made a double magic circle, but the EVA game characters Kechlin and Lucius revealed it in a day. With the image of the magic circle. Kechlin looks admiringly at Andreas and talks about how he remembered that Everlast potion was also his invention. He asks him about what he's going to show them in potions class today. Andreas gives him a perplexed look. Lucia stands and watches curious. Andreas, with a sly smile on his face, replies to Kechlin that he plans to keep a low profile, since he can't reveal all his secrets to the whole class. He also thinks about the fact that he doesn't want to stand out to Kyler. Suddenly, there is a massive explosion in front of them. Ketchlin covers his face with his hands in fright. Everything explodes into pieces, burning brightly. Andreas and Ketchlin watch with horror in their eyes. With interest, Dina stands in front of them, shielding herself with a magic ball. Andreas and Ketchlin look at her perplexed. She's out of classes for the day. Andreas looks at Dina without understanding and tries to call her name. She ignores him, focusing her gaze on what is in front of her.
Someone's huge hand is holding onto the wall. Dina screams loudly that it's a monster!
She points her finger at the imp. A horrible creature that looks like Malin comes out of the doorway. It looks terrible, its veins swollen, its mouth grinning. He utters only one name, Dina Alwyn, addressing her. He asks her how dare she make him look like an idiot. It's wide open. She starts correcting. Andreas watches in horror and can't believe his eyes. Vivian looks. The Ketchlin standing behind him immediately guesses it's Malin and whispers his name. A distraught man is approaching Dina. His body is getting bigger and bigger. Andreas and Ketchlin are standing not far from them. The whites of Malin's eyes turn black. All the veins on his face swell. His eyebrows frown. His gaze is piercing and furious. This is definitely a side effect of Kyler's potion. Malone is grinning gloatingly. He turns to Dina and says he'll show her what happens when he gets crossed. Flower. Dina looks at him menacingly and asks loudly about him being crazy. Andreas is horrified that an incident that should have happened during midterms has happened now. It's minus the fact that he relies too much on information from the game, and that he should have kept an eye on him since the beginning of the school year. An unknown man dressed in a robe is walking through the academy. In one hand, he carries a suitcase behind him. The unknown man stops, still holding the suitcase by the handle, and looks around. Belial, it's Kyler. You can see the peacefulness and calmness on his face. He tells himself that his farewell party has already started. Meanwhile, a serious fight breaks out between Malone and Dina. Malin raises his hand above his head, from which a ball of fire forms, with lights coming out of it. He furiously tells Dina that he's going to gag her. Dina stares at him silently. Without thinking long, he aims the fireball straight at Dina. She stands a little farther away from him, legs spread wide. At that moment, Andreas intervenes in their confrontation and swings his sword around dramatically. Malin looks at him perplexed, not understanding where he came from. His face is filled with terror and fear. Magic circle that Andreas coldly addresses Malin, calling him a dumbass. Dina, covering herself with her hand, calls out to Andreas. Andreas looks at Malone nonchalantly and tells him that there's no taking it back. Dina stands stunned and watches. Malone instantly recognizes Andreas. He says he's the freak. Drool is flowing from his mouth. Andreas looks at him and realizes that he's not completely out of his mind yet, which means he's recently drank a potion. The clothes are tearing on Malin's body. He clenches his fists tightly and says that everything is going perfectly, and that it would be easier for him to kill them both.
Because first he asked a question.
Ketchlin approaches Andreas and asks if he's okay. Andreas looks angrily at Ketchlin and tells him that he is fine. He sternly tells them that they had better step back. Dina stands behind them with her mouth wide open. Kuchlun informs Andreas that Malone has just killed Milko's student. Malin is furiously tearing at his clothes. Andreas looks away in disgust and decides to leave the cleaning to the professors to buy some time. He turns to Dina and tells her to prepare strong magic, the kind that can defeat him with a single blow. Dina looks at him fearfully and instantly agrees. At that moment, she's amazed to think about why Andreas is so calm. Malin stands fully naked to the waist. He rocks, growling and scowling with anger. Andreas looks at him and realizes that his body is incredibly strong. Andreas gives Malin a piercing look and tells Dina that with Ketchlin's support, she should be able to make it work. Can do? Ketchlin looks at him enthusiastically and smiles broadly. He's glad to see that he's on the subject too. Dina immediately rushes to do what Andreas told her to do and calls Ketchlin with her. Ketchlin frowns at Malin and hurries over to Dina. Dina and Ketchlin move a short distance away from them. Malon stares at them perplexed. Andreas concentrates on his every move.
Malin yells angrily after them, asking where they are running to. Drool flows from his huge mouth. He raises one hand up and creates fire mana. Andreas is standing right in front of him.
Meet a senior student now with his faulty fencing. Malin throws a flare of fire directly at Andreas, furiously wishing him dead. Andreas swings his sword to defend himself from the firelight directed at him.
Malone grinningly calls him a pig and says he's too loud.
Confidence. Andreas is angry at these words and draws his sword. His face is serious and focused. He tells Malin that if he can't talk properly, he should shut up. He moves in close to Malin and swings his long sword Galaxir at him. Malin looks at him perplexed and amazed at his boldness.
There is a bright flash of light that illuminates all around, obviously attacking him.
Malone forms a protective dome around himself in an instant. Dina and Keklin create a magic circle on the floor. Andreas looks angrily at Malon and realizes that even though he is spoiled, he is still a mage. He sees that the potion has made his defense shield much stronger. Giving appropriately, Malon smiles smugly. He gloats at his enemies and opens his mouth wide. Andreas's face changes. His eyes burn brightly, light streaks forming around his sword. He looks seriously at Malon and realizes that none of this matters. He is absolutely certain that he will easily penetrate his shield. As the senior swings his sword, Andreas heads lightning fast towards Malone, swinging his sword in different directions to pierce his shield. Dina watches all his actions carefully. Dina looks at Andreas in amazement and sees that he has enveloped the sword in magic even faster than he did in the tournament. Keklin is at this moment diligently working the magic circle. Andreas tries with all his might to pierce Malin's protective shield with his sword. He watches his sword move angrily. From Andreas's sword strikes on his shield, light spears shot in, flying past Malin. Andreas makes a mighty sword thrust at the shield, and a multitude of light best envelop him. The senior throws. At this time, Dina and Kechlin's light circles on the floor begin to glow with a bright light. Andreas doesn't lose hope, and continues to keep his sword stuck in Malin's shield. His eyebrows are furrowed, his teeth clenched. It's getting hard for him to hold his sword for so long. Their student even more. Keklin turns on Andreas and fearfully, with all his might, yells for him to watch out. And didn't even turn. Malin starts emitting light spears from his hand. At this point, his face is maddened, with a long tongue sticking out of his mouth. Andreas makes a lightning-fast decision to erect a shield of earth in front of him to at least defend himself against Malone's attacks. At this moment, a powerful earth shield is erected in front of Andreas. A multitude of fiery spears slam into it without hitting Andreas. Eyebrows. Andreas wonders about Malin going completely insane. He had just used attack magic while he had a barrier activated. Malin growls loudly. Andreas, for his part, tries to cover his face from the spears aimed at him. Malin is becoming quite unlike himself. Andreas realizes that things are bad. He realizes that he needs to stop it before it reaches the final stage. To the scene, Andreas rushes at him lightning fast, holding his trusty sword. He jumps up so high that he reaches his sword right over Malone's head. He hits him with a full swing. Malin backs up a little and addresses them. This blow angers Malin even more. He clenches his jaw and glares angrily at Andreas. Andreas realizes that Malin is hard as a rock. His teeth clench with hopelessness. At this point, Dina and Keklin have their hands on the centers of their magic circles. Dina looks at Andreas and tells him to step aside. To make inhuman noise, Andreas turns his head and sees what Dina and Keklin have created. He joyfully realizes that this is what is needed. Decides to drink it all at once. This unknown male is Andreas deftly dodges Malin, who wanted to grab him with his huge paws by doing a backflip. Andreas jumps aside. The moment Malone is distracted, Dina aims a magical blast at him. Dina looks extremely focused. She stares piercingly at Malone, putting her hands to her head, and begins to use the yellow piercing technique. A multitude of iron spears stab straight into Malin's huge body and stick out through. Andreas is horrified at what he sees. He stares at Dina in amazement and realizes that she has just used advanced magic. Many sharp iron spears stick out of Malin's body. Andreas reasoned that even if Dina had been helped by Keklin, he had never thought she could pierce his tough skin. Dina exhales and laughs gloatingly. Andreas realizes that this is to be expected from a cheater character. He is convinced that at this rate she can create her own magic before she even graduates from the academy. Andreas stares indifferently at Malin's impaled body. He realizes that he was the son of Milko, the headmaster of the academy, and that they will have a lot of problems because of it. Treatment. He looks around questioning. Andreas turns on them and tells Dina that she's obviously overreacting. Dina tells him that Malin has turned into a monster and that they will be in trouble. Keklin tells her that there is nothing he can do about it and that he will help with his testimony. Andreas looks suspicious. Andreas is confident that since Dina is involved, Bach will settle the matter behind closed doors. Andreas is determined to go somewhere and tells Dina and Keklin that if anyone comes, to explain to them what happened here. He decides to find Professor Kyler. Dina and Keklin look at him perplexed. Dina replies to him that that is exactly what they will do.
There is a bright explosion! Someone yells that they shouldn't even try to fight him and call the professors!
With Andreas is rapidly heading somewhere. He knows that Kyler must have gone to his hideout in the middle of the commotion and decides that he needs to get rid of him now before he brings more trouble. Andreas gives him Andreas is running down the street and looking around. He thinks about the fact that Kyler's potions might bring more problems in the next storylines. His attention is suddenly stopped on something. Whole class. Andreas hides behind a wall and sees a guy walking by. He doesn't notice him and walks by with a huge bag on his shoulder. Suddenly, there is a... Andreas remembers this guy. It's Antonio Holt. Antonio is walking tired. It's hard for him to carry such a heavy backpack. Andreas remembers that the guy who ran after Malin out of the auditorium is named Antonio Holt. He rarely showed up, so Andreas forgot all about him. Andreas peeks out from behind the wall and watches where he's going. He guesses that he was probably distributing Kyler's potions. He decides to follow him so he can definitely go after Kyler.
Someone's huge hand is holding onto the wall.
Suddenly, Andreas hears someone yelling for Lucia to run immediately. Andreas freezes in a stupor.
He turns his head around and what he sees in front of him amazes him.
Grinning. In the middle of the platform stands Lucia, having created a magic circle around her. Right above her sits a strange girl in tattered clothes. Behind Lucia's back lies a guy in the girl's arms. Vivian looks angrily.
A terrifying creature sits above Lucia, mouth wide open with a bright flash burning in it. Lucia turns to the students and orders them to run away from here immediately.
The girl, holding the guy's head by his head, asks Lucia fearfully, "What about her?" The guy starts to lose consciousness. All the veins on Lucia heads swiftly forward as bright walls of light flash in front of her. She flails her arms, trying to defend herself against them. An exasperated Dina, a pink glowing wall burns between Lucia and the terrifying creature. From the powerful explosion, the guy and girl sitting behind Lucia fly off a great distance, screaming loudly.
Easy? The bright pink light comes straight from the huge mouth of the horrible creature.
Lucia feels herself getting very hot from the outgoing light. She thinks with horror that she's going to die here. Lucia creates a huge light magic circle in front of her, pointing her hands forward. All she thinks is that if she had known this would happen, she wouldn't have bothered with the treatment. She sadly realizes that she should have just lived carefree. Belial Costello. It's Kyler. You can see the peace. At that moment, without a second's hesitation, Andreas rushed between them and with all his might knocked the fearsome creature down with a single swipe of his foot. The creature flies off to the side with a thud, from which a ball of fire. Lucia watches in amazement. It's all too sudden for her. She realizes that Andreas has just saved her and faints. Frightened students run out of the building in a scattering. One of them runs ahead of everyone else and tells the others that he is running to get the professors. Selena comes out of the gate, holding the hands of an injured Chris. Someone is loudly wondering if everyone has made it out. Luis excitedly turns to Selena and says that he is leaving Chris to her. You can see the congealed blood on Chris's face. Selena fearfully asks Luis about what he is up to. With her. He looks at Selena with a serious look and says that he will rush to help Vivian, as he has a bad feeling.
Suddenly, a cold-hearted Ivy appears from around the corner. She turns to the students and asks them what's all the fuss about.
Ivy looks serious and very focused. She glares at the students with her cold gaze and waits for them to explain. At this time, a pitched battle breaks out between Vivian and Todlin. They swing their swords with determination. Vivian realizes with horror that if she doesn't stop Todlin now, he will definitely go after Andreas. Todlin looks fierce and angry. He grits his teeth and swings his sword at Vivian with all his might. He approaches Vivian with a frantic look, clenching his jaw and waving his hand. Mouth wide. There is a scuffle. Vivian swings her sword at Todlin, but Todlin deftly holds her arms back.
Vivian has no choice but to swing her head with all her might and hit him. Vivian leans her head down and Todlin falls to the floor with a thud.
He gets up as if nothing had happened. A trickle of scarlet blood flows from his nose. He becomes even more ruthless and fierce. At that moment, she's amazed. Vivian looks at him questioningly, squinting her eyes slightly. Vivian looks in horror at the huge Todlin. He's getting bigger and bigger. The clothes on his body are ripping at the seams. Vivian, with blood frozen on her forehead, looks at him confusedly and realizes that this is very dangerous.
Todlin transforms into a mad monster with red eyes in front of his eyes. His mouth is wide open. Vivian looks at him and is finally convinced that this is why she has to finish him off.
She is rapidly approaching him, holding a long sword behind her back. Her eyes burn with hatred. Concentrates on. Vivian approaches Toddlin. He in turn covers his face with his hands to keep from being struck by the sword.
Drool.
Vivian looks at Toddlin in surprise and fear, her mouth slightly ajar.
Right.
Without wasting a moment, she leaps from her seat and leaps high. Malin throws. Before he can even get close enough to make a sword strike, Toddlin swings his huge paw as hard as he can and hits Vivian. She flies away from that impact a great distance and rolls on the ground. Vivian finds the strength to kneel down. She sees before her the bright drops of blood that drip from her face. She looks angrily at the slyly laughing Toddlin and realizes full well that she is still weak. She gets into an attack posture, holding her sharp sword out in front of her. Her strength slowly begins to leave her. She sadly realizes that she won't be able to protect Andreas like this.
Attacking him.
Toddlin angrily opens his huge maw so that all his teeth are visible. He growls loudly in an inhuman voice. Vivian's eyes turn white. No pupils are visible. She looks at Toddlin with hatred.
Toddlin furiously tries to pounce on Vivian. A bright pink mana forms around the bottom. Suddenly, Ivy comes up to Vivian and sternly tells her to stop. After all, she doesn't want her to die. Vivian stands in complete shock with her eyes wide open.
On his sword. Ivy nonchalantly walks over to the monster Toddlin and holds his huge hand tightly. Penetrated. She continues to hold up her hand and stares intently at Toddlin. She recognizes that he is the one in monster form and says she is sorry. Actions carefully. With one swing of her sword, she slices off his head and the arm she was holding tightly. Up the sword and Vivian looks devastated and surprised at what is happening and says Professor Ivy's name. Ivy stands over Toddlin's body in cold blood and puts her sword away on her belt. She says it's too late. Vivian stands behind her and marvels at how strong she is. Vivian stands behind Professor Ivy and tries to say something to her. Ivy feels a piercing gaze on her. Ivy turns to Vivian and praises her for lasting long enough to fight the Toddlin monster. At that moment, Vivian realizes that she must become even stronger than before. Stuck in Malin's. At this point, a battle continues between Andreas and the wild creature. Andreas grabs the unconscious Lucia and runs at high speed away from the furious creature. The wild creature runs after him with great speed. To buy time for a little while, Andreas creates an earthen protective shield between them. At that very second, a stone wall forms in front of the enraged creature. Andreas's only thought is that if Kyler manages to sneak away, the war storyline will become too problematic. He holds Lucia tightly against him and sadly realizes that he can't summon the undead in such a situation, so there's no way he can overpower her. Andreas runs away from the creature, while it has already destroyed the earth shield and is running after Andreas with even more fury. Andreas looks at Lucia carefully and decides that he needs to move her to safety first, and then go after Kyler. Malin, as he tries to run away, a man in a suit stands in front of him. Andreas recognizes him immediately and is surprised to see that it is Belial. To the scene. Andreas is outraged beyond belief. He is amazed that he is standing calmly as if nothing happened while his students are being attacked. His head. He hits it. Belial stands nonchalantly and silently watches what is happening. Andreas runs past him and says he's leaving the monster on him. Belial continues to stand quietly, folding his hands in his pants pocket. As hard as a rock. Belial looks after the fleeing Andreas and thinks about what he was hoping he would show him. At that moment, the creature comes at him with its jaws wide open. Him to step aside. Belial stands, ignoring her, and does not take his eyes off the receding Andreas. He hears an inhuman growl behind him. Decides to drink it. He silently turns to the creature and sizzles it with a single glance. A bright flash of light forms around it. Belial nonchalantly huffs. A flash occurs with such force that it illuminates the entire area of Rodlin Academy. Dina looks extreme. Andreas manages to carry Lucia to the hospital. He stands in front of the hospital bed where Lucia is lying unconscious. A nurse is next to her, trying to bring her to her senses. Huge body and stick out. The nurse says that Lucius is fine and that she's just in shock from the mana depletion. She assures her that she will be fine after she rests. Used advanced. She happily reports that Lucia is awake. Lucia tries to open her eyes. Andreas looks at her fearfully and tries to see how she's feeling. The nurse looks approvingly in their direction and says she has to go. Lucius asks Andreas in a weakened voice that it wasn't a dream. She says that she thought she was going to die. Andreas tells her that she was on the edge. He sternly asks her why she even got involved in this. Andreas stares. Lucia, annoyed, replies that she didn't really want to do it. But there were people there who couldn't escape, so she had no choice. Andreas, smiling good-naturedly, notes that she says it like a hero. At that moment, he thinks about the fact that if everything had gone according to plan, Lucia wouldn't have been hurt. He feels his guilt towards her. Lucius tries to get out of bed and angrily rebukes Andreas for almost dying. Andreas calmly replies to her that she seems to be fine since she has the strength to be sarcastic. Andreas realizes that she was in such great terror that she can now shut herself away in the lab and devote all her time to research. He decides. Lucius looks at Andreas leaving and sits down on the bed. She asks him resentfully about him coming to her just to mess with her. Andreas nonchalantly walks to the door and says he's busy, so he has to go. He stops suddenly at the door and turns his face slightly toward Lucia. He suggests to her that when this is all over, he should start working on her potions. Lucius looks at him in surprise, not believing her ears. Her mind suddenly flashes back to the moment when Andreas bursts into their fight with the fearsome creature. She remembers him violently kicking it with his leg to save Lucia. Lucia remembers that she could hardly see Andreas at that moment. She's wobbling all over the place. Her strength is almost completely gone. The last thing she remembers is Andreas reaching his hand towards her and angrily shouting her name. Andreas remembers. She lowers her head in embarrassment. She becomes ashamed of her behavior at the hospital. Through the gold-framed hospital window, you can see Lucia, who sits sadly with her head down. It's nightfall. In the forest, a huge owl with glowing eyes sits on the branch of a thick tree. Andreas walks confidently, skirting the huge cobblestones, heading towards the house. He reasons that according to the storyline, the fight with Kyler as boss should be in this hideout. He doubts if it will be here, since everything happens much earlier. Suddenly, Andreas hears someone yelling for Lucia to run immediately. In the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the trees, sits a small, unremarkable building. Andreas realizes that he needs partners to defeat Kyler. A magic circle next to Andreas appear his invariable assistants, the tiger Timur and the skeleton Nickel. Andreas, with a decisive movement of his hand, directs them straight to the shelter. They obey his orders without question.
Brightly colored explosions form around the house. The house explodes into pieces. Timur and Nickel smash it violently.
Andreas stands, squinting his eyes slightly. He looks unperturbed. He realizes perfectly well that he doesn't need to go that far.
Nickel grabs the man in the shelter by the throat and lifts him high above the ground. The guy screams loudly with desperation, opening his mouth wide.
Andreas looks at the guy in amazement and can't believe his eyes. He recognizes him and realizes that it is Antonio Holt. As Timur holds Antonio above the ground, Nickel walks up to him and chops Antonio's body in half with one swipe of his hand. Andreas guesses that Kyler is here as well. Here, Timur is standing on the ruins of the shelter. There is not a living thing left of him. Andreas stands and stares at him in silence. He sees that Timur has become much more powerful after the evolution, and that he easily defeated the monster at the peak of its power. See the peacefulness and calmness. Timur stands with his head down, his eyes burn with a red light. He growls heavily. Down with a single. The electronic scoreboard says that he is a legendary dead berserker. His rank is 6. His mana is 2010. His hallmark is ego, and his skill is melee and berserk. Andreas turns his attention to Nickel's skeleton and speculates that he is enhanced with mortal sins, so a medium difficulty boss won't be a problem for him. To get the professors. Beside Andreas steps huge paws and boots. Andreas humbly crouches down to what's left of the hut. Loudly wondering, a voice is heard from beneath the ruins asking who is here. Andreas and Nickel look puzzled at where the voice is coming from. Andreas puts his hand to the floor, creating a magic circle and fumbles for something. He looks in the floor in front of them. A door to the basement opens. There is absolute darkness. Andreas looks carefully into the passageway where a huge staircase leads. He decides, without a fraction of a doubt, to go down there to visit the terrorist. He calls his faithful assistants, Nickel and Timur, to follow him. Andreas slowly treads down the stairs leading downstairs. Pitched from what he sees, his expression changes and becomes surprised. Black rays begin to emanate from the basement. Andreas, Nickel, and Timur dodge them out of surprise. Kyler stands in the blackness, frowning his eyebrows and squeezing his eyes shut. He asks Andreas about how he knew about this place. Kyler slowly rises from the basement, black mana enveloping his body. Andreas and his aides are waiting for the moment to attack. Timur clenches his fists tightly. Kyler glares furiously at Andreas with a furrowed brow and clenched teeth. He coldly refers to Andreas as Karen's assistant. The powerful arm of a huge giant is visible from the sky. It approaches Kyler to grab him. Kyler freezes, his eyes bulging. A huge hand strikes where Kyler is, and he manages to deftly jump and dodge the blow. Huge tot. Kyler is looking perplexed somewhere. Eyebrows furrowed, the corners of his cube pulled down. In an instant, his arm below the elbow flies off. He watches it with horror, unable to believe his eyes.
Kyler is starting to feel the pain. His face wrinkles, his jaw clenches, his pupils constrict.
He shifts his attention to Nickel, who has ruthlessly cut off his arm and is right now distancing himself from him. Andreas turns. Kyler tries to touch his severed arm. He howls in pain. His mouth is wide open. Andreas coldly smiles slyly and apologizes to Kyler, for it was his head that was supposed to fly off, not his arm. Kyler bloodily heads towards him. Black clots envelop his body. He angrily calls Andreas a brat and says that he realized that it was Andreas who killed Karen. Malin throws a flare of fire directly. At that moment, a tiger named Timur appears behind him. He swings at Kyler, clasping his hands together. Kyler turns back frightened. Timur jumps up and soars high up. He delivers a powerful high kick to where Kyler is. Andreas watches them coolly and tells Timur to finish him off with one punch. She looks angrily at the...
Timur looks furious! He opens his mouth wide so that you can see his sharp fangs and growls loudly!
He lunges downward, aiming his powerful fist at where Kyler is. From that powerful blow, everything around him shatters into small pieces.
Attacking him.
Andreas looks questioningly at what's going on, perplexed as to what's going on there. In an inhuman voice,
Timur's paw shoots up into the resulting shield of Kyler! Timur growls loudly as he tries to get his paw out of there.
At this minute, Timur begins to become completely enveloped by the slimy streaks released by Kyler. He tries to break free of them. Andreas is dumbfounded, saying it's unfathomable. Complete shock with her eyes wide, the color of the slurry turns to swampy. And in front of Timur there is a terrible monster, completely covered with this slurry instead of Kyler. Timur furiously tries to get out of there. The monster's arm slowly grows back into place. Actions carefully. With the scary monster, Kyler looks terrible. His eyes bark, and his teeth are replaced by sharp fangs. He turns to Andreas and says that black mages are so selfish, and that he didn't think Andreas would kill the one who raised him. Andreas looks at him coldly and thinks about the fact that this is his final stage of shadow armor, which can regenerate lost body parts. Vivian stands behind. Andreas stands in front of him, holding a sword in his hand. He asks the behemoth Kyler about the fact that he created shadow armor. It is amazed at how he knows this. Behemoth Kyler looks at Andreas in exasperation and says that it can't be, because no one can know about it except Mr. Just. Andreas raises his hand up, holding his sword in it. He emits a bright flash and aims it at Kyler's monster. Kyler freezes in surprise and continues to stand still. Speed. The flash of light fired by Andreas is aimed at Kyler but doesn't hit him. He deftly dodges to the side and Timur flies back. At that, Timur frees himself from the shackles that enveloped his body. Andreas explains to Kyler that he is well informed about the shadow armor. He says that it is a very rare and high-quality item that is good for both defense and offense. Against him, and sadly, Kyler laughs gloatingly and looks at Andreas. He says then Andreas should realize that he has a chance of winning. Andreas doesn't let him finish. He notes that his armor has one weakness, fire. He holds a sword in his hand from which fire begins to emanate. Kyler looks at him perplexed and amazed at how he knows all this. After Kyler. Sharp spears formed from the black slurry are aimed at Andreas. He tries to pull back so they don't hit him. Sharp spears fly swiftly at Andreas. He deftly dodges them. Kyler says that he doesn't care that his armor is afraid of fire, and that he just needs to not give him time to use the spell. His head. He hits him with a... Sharp spears are closing in on Andreas. Kyler stretches his bony arms to grab him. Kyler, as the bogeyman, looks malevolent and cunning. His eyes shine brightly, his jaw clenched. In an instant, the tiger Timur approaches him and angrily hits him with all his might so that he flies away a great distance. Andreas and Timur look after the falling Kyler. Andreas glances at Timur and tells him to get Nickel, and they begin to wear down the enemy. Timur gives him a short growl in response, and sizzles it with a... Kyler gets up as if nothing had happened and heads over to Andreas. He gets an even angrier look on his face. He turns to Andreas and asks him about what he thinks a regular undead would buy him time. He approaches Andreas furiously, reaching out a bony hand to grab him. He says with a sarcastic expression that this is just ridiculous. Nickel stares fiercely at Kyler without taking his eyes, which are brimming with hatred. From the mana depletion, Timur rocks his jaws angrily. His eyes glow bright red.
A bright flare of fire of immense proportions appears in front of Andreas.
Sharp barbs form on Andreas's sword. Andreas tries to touch them and exhales. He notes that it took him longer than he bargained for. The swamp sludge begins to envelop Timur again. He tries with all his might to get rid of it, tearing it with his paw. Nickel jumps up and swings his long sword with all his might.
Kyler raises his arm up, and as he does so, his slime lifts Nickel off the ground.
He turns to Andreas and gloatingly tells him that even if a whole mob of mindless undead pounce on him, he does not have time to finish his speech and falls silent. He sees that the tiger Timur is almost out of his fetters. He shifts his gaze towards Nickel and marvels at the fact that this one managed to get out too.
He is enraged beyond belief that mere undead can handle his shadow shackles. He thinks it's completely absurd.
To her that she seems to. While he is musing, Timur and Nickel are already breaking free of their shackles and heading for Kyler at breakneck speed. Kyler wonders who they are. He covers his head with his hands to shield himself from the blows. For a moment, he assumes they are the ones from the meeting. Timur is already hitting him as hard as he can, and he flies off again. The door, and Kyler stands up as if nothing had happened, but his expression becomes even more angry and enraged. To her, the Galaxir sword in Andreas's hand transformed into a bone whip. Andreas performed fusion magic. Kyler quickly walks through the ruins left of the shelter, and is amazed to see Andreas holding a whip in his hand. Nickel is lightning fast heading towards Kyler, swinging his sword at him. Kyler, in order to keep Nickel from getting any closer to him, emits his shadow shackles from his hand. Andreas rushes to Nickel's aid, waving his new weapon. Andreas heads towards Kyler. In his hand is his long whip, the end of which is approaching Kyler. He tries to dodge it in terror, but he fails to do so, and the whip wraps around his body to restrict his movement and bind his hands. The whip pressed tightly against his body, and the sharp barbs dug into him painfully. Kyler stands completely immobilized and looks at Andreas in bewilderment. He rebukes him for saying he would use fire. Andreas pulls the whip even tighter. Kyler's one arm is still free. Kyler tries to get Andreas emotional and asks him not to tell him that he only knows how to use his tongue. He asks him about his inability to use flames. Andreas's gaze is full of hatred. He looks at Kyler and says that this trick could cost him his life. He applies the bone blast. Variable assistance. A trickle of blood runs from Andreas's nose down his chin, entering his mouth.
The whip on Kyler's body ignites in an instant with bright flames. Kyler realizes with horror that Andreas has used a double spell. Form around the house. A bright explosion envelops the entire space. Andreas stands in front of him. Timur is behind him.
Andreas, wiping the blood from his face, notes that it was harder than he expected. He says that Dina is quite something, since she was able to pull it off so easily.
Her by the throat and lifts him.
Andreas is pleased with himself. He says that the new technique worked out well, except that Kyler's body turned to dust because he put in too much mana. Trinity stands and watches what is happening. Timur begins to slowly fade away. It is Antonio Holt. Andreas walks off into the distance all alone. He realizes that after a high-profile event like Kyler's death, the assembly is sure to make its move. He decides that for now he should take the item from the hideout, cover his tracks, and leave. He guesses that the academy must be in chaos right now, so he decides to get back there as soon as possible. Stands and stares at him in silence. Someone's powerful fist hits the table with all its might, and that Bass Alwyn asks someone to repeat again how many people there were. His face expresses horror and slight consternation. A young guy with glasses fearfully reports that there are 15 people in total, including 4 students from Milko Academy. Zerker. Bach Alwyn stands angrily, propped up on the table. The guy continues to report that, according to witnesses, the potions were distributed by Antonio Holt, who soon disappeared. He says that Antonio is Professor Kyler's assistant. Boss won't be a problem for him. Bach Alwyn sits down in his chair and sternly interrupts his story, saying that he has had enough. He orders that all academy activities be postponed until the investigation into the case is complete. He says that further details will be announced after a meeting with Principal Zeos. The boy silently removes himself from the office. Bach Alwyn sits angrily at his desk. His face is frowning. He looks fierce and very angry. He is amazed at what is happening at Rodlin Academy. Case leads. The ruins from the shelter continue to lie motionless in the vacant lot. Andreas walks down the stairs and speculates that maybe it's about the broken course of history, but there are a lot of items he's never seen, and most of them are some kind of bullshit. Andreas scrutinizes the shelf of books. He picks one up and sees that it's Kyler's book, and there are more entries about shadow magic. He, as a black mage, is curious about it, but he has never paid attention to it before. Nickel holds out to Andreas a black book with a golden image of a cross. Without even turning to him, Andreas tells Nickel to put it down as well. The basement. Andreas stops his gaze questioningly at something interesting. Against the wall is an unusual red chest with gold inlays. Andreas takes a long look at it. Andreas immediately guesses that it's a chaos chest. Nickel stares at him incomprehensibly. Andreas is shocked that he came so close to it and didn't feel it. An ugly hand with an eye climbs out of the red chest and stares piercingly at Andreas. Andreas stared at the chest in concentration. He concludes that it means someone has separated him and Mimic's body, which means that he can safely take the treasure without having to fight the monster. In an instant, his arm below the elbow, Andreas resolutely approaches the chest to look inside. Andreas opens the chest and thinks about the fact that he'll only take the contents if Kyler didn't take them. He knows one rule. He can only get 3 items out of there, and it will turn into a regular chest. Andreas reaches out to stick his hand inside. He realizes that it's rare to come across something like this, so all the items inside are very valuable. Slyly and apologetic, Andreas resolutely sticks his hand inside the chest, which contains a strange slurry that makes it impossible to see what's inside. The first thing Andreas fumbles and pulls out is a huge golden key. The next thing he pulls out is the Chaos Mimic Core. It's such a black ball with lightning inside. Andreas continues to carefully fumble for something valuable inside the chest. He realizes that he can't use the Chaos Mimic Core right now, but he is confident that it will be of use to him. Andreas watches them coolly and tells Team. Suddenly his hand touches something hard and a loud thud is heard. Andreas stops in surprise. From a trunk he pulls out a slightly rusted antique sword and is greatly surprised to find that. He lunges downward. He pulls it completely out of the chest and scrutinizes it closely. The electronic scoreboard says it's an ever-changing sword. Its mana conductivity is 0. The shape and attributes of the sword change depending on who uses it. Andreas takes the sword in both hands and scrutinizes it. He thinks about the fact that he already has a Galaxir sword, and that he doesn't need this sword. Behind him, he hears an unintelligible sound, and perplexedly turns around to look at it. Break free of that. Nickel stands silently in front of him and holds out his hands, asking for Andreas to give this sword to him. Andreas agrees without objection and gives him the sword. He smiles good-naturedly at Nickel and tells him that he was just about to buy him a new sword. Nickel clutches the hilt of the sword tightly. The monster's arm slowly grows. Andreas looks at him with undisguised surprise. A blue negativity begins to form around him. A confident Nickel stands before him, holding his sword firmly in his hands. His eyes are burning. The electronic scoreboard reads that it is an ever-changing sapling. Its mana conductivity is 150% and its strike speed is 200%. The damage increases if the wielder takes a stance for a period of time. Vivian stands. Andreas looks at Nickel in amazement and marvels that the shape and balance of the sword has adjusted to him. He is pleased that Nickel also has additional parameters and now has a named item. At that, Andreas continues to look at Nickel with his arms folded at his side and tells him to carry his things, as it's time for him to go back to the academy. Andreas raises his. 5 days pass. The train in which Andreas is traveling arrives at the platform. He gets off the train and someone calls him loudly. Speed. Andreas steps off the train and looks around indifferently, not expecting anyone to greet him. Deftly dodges to the side. A little farther away he spots a happy Lucia waving cheerfully at him. Lucia opens her mouth wide, smiling happily. She waves her hand vigorously at Andreas to get his attention. Armor. Andreas calmly goes to meet her and tells her that she didn't have to meet him. Lucia cheerfully runs to him and tells him that Daddy told her to play with him because he has an important guest coming over. He has a chance. Andreas looks at her suspiciously and suggests they go to her place to start doing research, as they need to get as much done as possible while the academy is closed. Lucia, as usual, starts mimicking Andreas and making faces. Andreas looks at her angrily. Lucia becomes flirtatious and suggests to Andreas to have fun. She tells him flirtatiously that his lovely friend, meaning herself, will show him around the city, and Andreas interrupts her sternly and says that they have to go as they have little time. And that Andreas silently steps forward, and when Lucia is behind him and out of sight, he smiles pleasantly. Lucia, left behind him, sighs heavily and looks away. They drive down a forest road in a carriage pulled by 2 horses. Lucy tells Andreas that she heard that the son of the academy director Milko was also among the victims. Then she angrily adds that he caused trouble until the very end. Andreas and Lucia, trying to keep her voice down, informs Andreas that since Dina dealt with him, she was not responsible for it. Andreas indifferently replies to Lucia that it's not surprising since her father was a duke, and one of the 10 strongest on the continent even before he became the head of the Rodland Magic Tower. But still, this incident has damaged the reputation of House Alwyn. Lucius enthusiastically replies that it's great that Dina has those who can help her. She abruptly shifts the conversation and asks Andreas about Professor Kyler. Andreas indifferently replies that he was killed by a monster he created himself. Timur Rock. Lucia stares dreamily out the window and says that Professor Kyler is a fool for creating a monster he couldn't even handle. She adds that being alive is a real blessing. Tries to touch them and Andreas takes his eyes off the book with a serious look and looks intently at Lucia. The swamp. Andreas thinks of Kyler and Antonio's bodies in the vacant lot. He thinks about the fact that he made it look like that's what happened, although he is sure that they are secretly investigating the case. He realizes that he needs to be more careful. The coachman announces that they have arrived. The carriage stops at a fancy 3-story palace near a massive gate. He does not have time. They get off the wagon, and Lucia curiously asks Andreas about why he decided to get down to business if he's always so busy. Andreas indifferently replies that he thought he could help her while he signed the contract for the new potions.
That mere undead can handle his shadow shackles.
They head towards the front door of Lucia's house. She looks at Andreas in surprise and asks if he's serious now. Their shackles and heading, they stop abruptly as an emotional scene unfolds in front of them. A woman turns to Lucia's father named Hollington and says that she didn't think he would play with her. For a moment he assumes. Lucius and Andreas slowly move closer to them and listen intently to their conversation. Hollington guiltily explains to her that the orc of the Great Forest is a very dangerous beast, and that's why he had a hard time getting the ingredients. The girl turns to him frustrated and asks about the fact that he thinks orcs are scarier than her. Performed fusion magic. Kyler. Suddenly Lucius calls out to her father. He and the girl standing next to him stare at her. The girl points her finger at Lucia and gives Hollington a sly look. Is she asking him about the fact that it's his daughter? Hollington tries to act as if he doesn't know what she's talking about. And a green screw forms at the spot where the girl was, and she disappears from sight. The girl finds herself next to Lucia and hugs her affectionately by the shoulders. She calls her to her, calling her darling. Andreas looks at them incomprehensibly. Whip wraps around his body to Lucia asks her fearfully about where she is calling her. The girl, glancing at her, explains to her that her daddy didn't keep his promise. Kyler stands. Andreas looks suspiciously at the girl holding Lucia and feels a terrifying power from her. He wonders who she is. Tighter. Hollingtog, Lucia's father, is confused and frightened and runs towards her, trying to stop her. He addresses her, calling her Lady Hangenthal, and begs her to spare him. The girl instantly disappears with Lucia, leaving behind a flash of light. Andreas and Hollington stare at the place where she had just been. A trickle of blood. The girl holding Lucia in her armpits suddenly finds herself on the roof of their house. She tells her father that she will bring her back the next time she returns. She demands that he make sure next time she comes back that he has the neutralizer.
The entire
Hollington, sensing the hopelessness of the situation, looks at them and says nothing. Andreas says Lucia's name at a loss. Harder than he expected. The girl nonchalantly holds Lucia under her arm and wishes them both good luck. Lucia, frustrated, calls out Andreas's name and is amazed to see a tattoo of magic on the girl's arm. Andreas begins to guess something. In surprise, he opens his mouth wide and bulges his eyes. Fade away. Suddenly, Andreas has a thought that it's Salem. He says the name loudly in such a way that the girl freezes for a moment. She turns to Andreas so that he can now see her face. He matches it to Salem's face and realizes it's him. The girl smiles slyly and tells Andreas that they haven't seen each other in a long time now, so he decides to get back there as soon as possible. Lucia Hollington's father is in complete shock. His eyebrows are furrowed, his mouth slightly open. Lucius also looks questioningly in Andreas's direction and doesn't understand what he's saying. Andreas calmly approaches Salem in the form of a girl and asks him about if he could put the girl down. Salem looks at him pityingly, calling him a wee one, and asks about the fact that he's only been nice to him once, and now he's giving him orders? Propped up on the table. Andreas looks glum. He tries to convey to Salem that this isn't an order and that he's just asking him to do it. He promises that in return, he will give him information that will be just as valuable. Salem looks at Andreas nonchalantly and asks him if he can back up his words with deeds, and reminds him that the tongue is his worst enemy. He orders. Andreas mentions a book written by the god of the mythological era. The mention makes Salem's eyes go wide. He immediately understands what Andreas means. Andreas stares at him intently and promises to tell him where she can be found. Salem turns up beside them at the same second, holding a crying Lucia in his arms. Salem stares intently at Andreas and asks him about the book and where it is. Andreas wonders about whether Salem is sure he should talk about it right here. Behind him stands a crying Lucia and her father. But there are a lot. At the same second, Lucia and her father turn away and cover their ears with their hands so they can't hear anything. Salem sternly orders Andreas to tell him where the book is, and if it is not there, he will kill them all on the spot. But he has never paid attention to it. Andreas recalls the map in his head, and informs him with a calm look that the book is in the river Irva, which lies on the southwestern border of the empire. He specifies that it should be in an underground cave a direction for 7 hours. It's something interesting. Moment to attack. Salem thinks for a moment and asks Andreas if he made that up to buy time. Salem, in the form of a girl, looks suspiciously at Andreas and asks him about where he got this information from. Andreas guiltily bows to Salem and says that he can't tell him anything else. Salem indifferently agrees and tells him to keep his secret from now on. Andreas realizes that this is just data from the game. Andreas stared at the chest in concentration. Salem is about to leave and turns to Hollington, saying that she's letting him get away with it this time, and that he should know what happens next time. Hollington guiltily lowers his head with his eyes covered and says that he promised, which is why he will gather the necessary materials at any cost. He thinks about the fact that he'll only take the contents if Salem says that the merchant lives and dies by his credibility. In the moment she turns to Andreas to ask how he realized it was him, Andreas calmly explains that, as of late, he can see the flow of mana. To come across, an electronic scoreboard appears in front of Andreas, on which it is written that his talents are black magic, gifted necromancy, elemental magic, gifted water, excellent buff-making ability, and gifted mana. Andreas looks at him thoughtfully, and muses that he didn't realize his talent for magic along with the vessel trait came so naturally to him. It's such a black... Salem silently walks away with a wave of his hand and says goodbye. Andreas knows that he has put many magic circles on his body to enhance his magic, but his body ends up disintegrating because of it. But he is confident that it will be of use. Andreas stares intently after the departing Salem. He realizes that this is why he, like Lucia, has a time bomb. Lucia stands behind him and continues to... Andreas recalls the book he told Salem about. It contains the knowledge of harmony. Andreas realizes that if Salem reads it and can maintain harmony between his body and the magic circle, he will survive. Lucia's father turns to Andreas and promises that he will definitely thank him. Andreas embarrassedly replies that he shouldn't do that. Lucia curiously asks Andreas where he met Salem Edida. Andreas indifferently replies that it was by chance and turns the conversation away. He says that what is more important now is where her lab is located. Nickel stands silent. Lucia tisks resentfully and says she won't let him in there. She explains that she won't let someone who might be working with the Empire's most wanted criminal in there. Lucia's father, feeling superfluous, coughs demonstratively and says it's time for him to go inside. Andreas asks Lucia if this means that she won't let the Viscount in either. Negativity begins to form. Lucia replies resentfully that she won't even let Daddy in there. She asks Andreas why he shouldn't sign the contract, since that's what he came here for. And says that Andreas lowers his eyes and tells Lucia not to be so mean, and that it's not like they have to sign a contract. And it strikes. Suddenly a small pool of blood forms in front of Lucia's feet. She, without noticing it, replies to Andreas that he is the evil one, since he always hides something from her. Andreas opens his eyes fearfully at the sight of the pool of blood in front of Lucia. He is confused and addresses her by name. Lucia dazedly grabs her nose with her hands and realizes that it's bleeding. Andreas frightenedly tries to ask Lucia if she is all right. She immediately runs away upset, covering her nose with the palm of her hand, and saying that everything is not all right, and that she did not want him to see her like this. Andreas looks at Lucia perplexed as she begins to stagger. Her body and clothes are stained with drops of blood. After walking a chud further, Lucia falls to the ground with a thud. A pool of blood slowly forms around her head. Andreas runs up to her and tries to call out to her, but it proves unsuccessful. It cheerfully runs to him.